Thank you, Madam Deputy President. I also rise to speak on the Family Assistance Legislation Amendment Bill 2020, and I'll say from the outset, as my colleagues have done so, Labor is supporting this bill because it makes a number of changes which will improve assistance to vulnerable and disadvantaged families. And fundamentally, they need help now more than ever, and if this bill goes some way towards providing that help, then it's something that we, of course, would support. But the conversation can't be left there, because we know this bill doesn't go nearly far enough in supporting both the vulnerable families who depend on our early childhood system, the educators within it, and the system itself. Even prior to this pandemic, the early childhood sector in Australia was in crisis. Fees soaring without any real way of getting them under control, serious issues in the rollout of the government's response, which we warned them about, which still manifested because ultimately the government doesn't get early childhood, they don't get childcare, they don't get the sector, and they don't value it in the way that they should. Because when it comes to early childhood, our expenditure in this area, the things we do ultimately are a choice about what we value as a community. And I think we see time and time again from the government that they see this sector, they see childcare as babysitting, they don't see it as early learning. And fundamentally we have to see it as early learning, because that will drive the appropriate policy responses on cost, on quality, on access, and especially for vulnerable families. We know parents are paying too much for childcare at the moment, and that is a huge issue. It's an issue which the government needs to get on control of. But I know that's difficult because you're always balancing in early childhood this question of cost and this question of quality and this question of access. It's a tricky conundrum. It's an expensive conundrum, but it's a conundrum worthy of us trying to solve. It's a conundrum that we need to actually put our money towards, put our minds towards, if we really want to make a difference, not only to the lives of children, but to productivity in Australia. Because ultimately investing in early education is one of the best things we can do to grow our economy, not just now but well into the future. We know that for every dollar spent on early learning in Australia, we could generate $2 worth of benefits to our broader economy. That's a huge return on investment. We also know that childcare is critical to women's participation in the workforce, and the Grattan Institute has shown us that it's one of the best ways that we can enhance this participation, and that could bring us a multi-billion-dollar impact on gross domestic product. Of course, these issues were the issues which surrounded our sector prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic has come along, and like in so many ways in our community, in our country, it has just completely changed the way work operates and the way sectors like early childhood operate. The pandemic had a devastating impact on our early childhood sector. The government was far too slow in responding to it. And our educators, who I talk to every day, were worried, scared early on that they were on the front line of this crisis, but no one was really seeing that they were. They didn't have access to PPE, they didn't know where to get it. They didn't know how to run their centres and what to do and how to handle these changes. The package which came in to support them wasn't well thought through. It left some centres much worse off. It left families not able to access the care they needed. It left women returning from maternity leave wanting to go back into jobs like being ICU nurses, unable to access a place in childcare and therefore not go to work and fight the pandemic. And that early childhood educators who are raising these issues were never given that seat at the table that they needed so that the government could get on top of it. The package saved a lot of centres, and we're grateful for those ones that it helped. But then came the inexplicable decision to throw early childhood educators, and only early childhood educators, off JobKeeper. Now, what does that say to these educators who, through this pandemic, have been doing critical work? And let's face it, often risky work. It's very hard to socially distance from a toddler. I've got one, I know. It's not really possible. And when a toddler needs their nose blown, you've just got to get in there and do it. These guys were doing risky work. And they were the first ones, the only ones, thrown off JobKeeper. Their anxiety has been sky high during this pandemic, and I get it. But the government doesn't. They never have. There is so much more we need to do for these early childhood educators to see them through this pandemic, to give them the confidence they need, that they'll have the PPE, that their centres can survive, that they can provide the care for the children they need. And for vulnerable kids especially, we need to make sure we get this right. One of my first fears when this pandemic started, and we saw parents having their children home from school, either by choice or by necessity, depending on the state that they lived in. And we also saw parents withdrawing their children from early childhood because they too were worried about what the implications would be for the health of their kids. And when we saw parents do this, my first thought was, what about those most vulnerable kids in early childhood and childcare? Because we know for too many children in Australia, that interaction with their educators in early childhood, that attendance at childcare, can have an enormous difference on their lives. It can be the difference between abuse being reported and not. It can be the difference between knowing a child is getting enough meals and enough nourishment or not. These early childhood educators working with vulnerable children are saving lives, and often they are the only love and support that a child gets. Often they're the only ones who do things like sit with a child and count their fingers and toes, critical things which actually so many of us take for granted. But if you don't count a child's fingers and toes out loud, you don't have that early counting, that early language and interaction, critical brain connections will not form and that child will not develop as a child should. The work our early educators do is critical. It's critical for individual children and it's critical for our community. What happens to those vulnerable kids who left early childhood? What happens if they don't come back? What happens if they miss that critical part of their early learning? It will change their brain development. That is a lifelong implication for these kids, to be locked out of the early childhood sector, even for weeks. And imagine if it's months or years. We can't afford that. Those kids can't afford that. Our country can't afford that. These vulnerable children, which this bill, I acknowledge, tries to help, there are much bigger challenges ahead of them too. And until we get a handle of those, until we know that we can ensure access, until we know that our early educators have the confidence to do their job, to be there for these kids and all kids, then we're failing. The government needs to do so much more in this space. I implore them to look at the research, look at the brain maps. You can actually hold up the scans of brains and see those critical connections form. It is incredible. Some of the most simple acts that we do as parents that are repeated by early childhood educators and built on. Their work is incredible, and they have been doing it so incredibly tough during the pandemic. And I want to use this opportunity to thank them. Thank all of them. Thank not just the educators, but the administrators working in centres, trying desperately to balance the books to keep their centres thriving and continuing, because they know how important it is that children have continuity of care. They know how important the work is that they're doing. And they also know how important it is to keep their early educators in work and secure and safe. So our administrators too, I thank you, our directors as well, because it has been such an incredibly stressful time for all of you. During this pandemic, it is workers like our early childhood workers who have been on the front line. These are also some of the workers in our community who have been the least valued historically in terms of their pay and in terms of their conditions. So let this be a wake-up call for us. They are doing essential work. They are doing it at the toughest of times. And so once we get through this pandemic, once we get through the critical questions we know we have to face to make sure our educators are okay, to make sure those children they care for are okay, then let's look at the workforce. Let's look at wages. Let's look at actually valuing these educators for the critical role that they do. They are changing lives, and more than that, they are changing our country, they are changing our future. Our whole productivity, our whole future prosperity in Australia depends on our education system, and our education system does not start at school. It starts when a child first walks into an early learning centre. We have to make sure during this pandemic we don't see any child walk out of their early learning centre and not return, because the consequences of that are absolutely catastrophic. I commend this.